Hey everyone, before we get into what's really happening in Florida right now, I need you to do something. If you're struggling with housing, whether that's rising rent, the threat of eviction, trying to buy your first home, or just trying to survive in this market, hit that subscribe button right now. We're covering housing issues every single week, breaking down the policies that are crushing working families, and most importantly, giving you real information and resources you can actually use. This isn't just about complaining. It's about understanding what's happening and fighting back. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's get into this together. All right, so let's talk about Florida, because what's happening there right now is absolutely explosive, and Governor Ron DeSantis can't hide from it anymore no matter how hard he tries. For years, DeSantis has been selling Florida as this incredible success story, this beacon of freedom and prosperity, where people are flooding in from across the country to escape high taxes and government overreach. He's built an entire political plan, Florida, but that model is crumbling right before our eyes. And the housing crisis that's destroying lives across the state is exposing everything that's wrong with his approach to governance. Here's what they don't want you to see. Florida's housing crisis isn't some unfortunate accident of market forces. It's not just bad luck or an inevitable result of popularity. It's a direct consequence of specific policy decisions made by DeSantis and the Republican-controlled legislature. They chose to prioritize corporate profits over working families. They chose to get tenant protections while making it easier for landlords to exploit renters. They chose to let Wall Street firms and international investors buy up residential properties without limits. They chose to ignore the insurance crisis and climate risks that were obviously going to explode. And now, the consequences of those choices are impossible to hide. Let's start with the numbers that DeSantis doesn't want to talk about. The median home price in major Florida cities has become completely disconnected from what actual Floridians earn. In Miami, the median home price hit over $600,000. In Tampa, it's over $400,000. Orlando, Naples, Fort Lauderdale, all of them have seen prices skyrocket to levels that are simply unattainable for teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters, the people who actually make communities function. Meanwhile, the median household income in Florida is around $60,000 a year. Do the math. It doesn't work. It never could work. But DeSantis kept pushing the narrative that everything was great, that Florida was thriving, even as working families were being crushed. And it's not just home prices. Rents have gone absolutely insane. We're talking about one-bedroom apartments in Orlando going for $2,000 a month. Studio apartments in Miami for $2,500 or more. Even in smaller cities and towns across the state, rents have doubled in just a few years. People who have lived in the same apartment for a decade are suddenly getting notices that their rent is increasing by $500, $1,000, $1,500 a month. Where are they supposed to get that money? Wages haven't increased anywhere near that much. So people are making impossible choices. Do I pay rent or do I buy food? Do I stay housed or do I pay for my medications? Do I keep my kids in their school or do we move 2 hours away where it's cheaper and I lose my job? But here's where it gets really infuriating. While all of this was happening, DeSantis was actively making it worse. In 2023, he signed legislation that essentially banned local rent control across Florida. Cities and counties that wanted to implement emergency rent stabilization to protect their residents were blocked from doing so by state law. The justification was that rent control would discourage development and hurt the market. But you know what actually hurts people? Not being able to afford a place to live. Not being able to stay in your community. Having to uproot your entire life because some corporate landlord decided to maximize their profits. DeSantis also made it significantly easier for landlords to evict tenants. The process was streamlined, tenant protections were weakened, and the result has been a wave of evictions across the state. Families are being thrown out of their homes with minimal notice and little recourse. And where do they go? Homeless shelters are overflowing. Motels are filled with families living week to week because they can't afford first and last month's rent plus security deposit for an apartment. People are living in their cars, in tents, doubled up with relatives in overcrowded and unsafe conditions. Now, let's talk about something DeSantis really doesn't want to expose: the role of corporate landlords and Wall Street in Florida's housing crisis. Over the past several years, private equity firms and large institutional investors have bought tens of thousands of single-family homes across Florida. They're not buying these homes to live in them. They're buying them as investments, as assets to extract profit from. They use algorithms to set rents, coordinating price increases across entire markets. They fight against any attempt to regulate them. And they have enormous political power, which they use to influence legislation in their favor. DeSantis has been completely on their side. His administration has opposed any meaningful regulation of corporate landlords. When housing advocates have pushed for laws requiring transparency in rental pricing or limiting the number of homes a single entity can own in a given area, DeSantis' allies have shot them down. Why? Because these corporations donate heavily to Republican campaigns. Because they're part of the business-friendly environment that DeSantis loves to brag about. But business-friendly doesn't mean people-friendly. What's good for Blackstone's bottom line is absolutely terrible for a single mother in Jacksonville trying to find an affordable place to raise her kids. The short-term rental issue is another massive problem that DeSantis has completely failed to address. Airbnb and VRBO have transformed entire neighborhoods across Florida into de facto hotel districts. Investors buy up homes and condos and convert them to short-term rentals because they can make more money that way than with long-term tenants. This removes housing from the residential market, drives up prices for everyone else, and destroys the character of communities. Residents find themselves living next to what are essentially unlicensed hotels, with strangers coming and going constantly, parties, noise, no sense of neighborhood anymore. Other cities and states have dealt with this by implementing reasonable regulations. They limit the number of short-term rentals in residential areas. They require permits and inspections. They protect housing stock for actual residents. But DeSantis went the opposite direction. Florida passed a law preempting local regulations on short-term rentals, making it nearly impossible for cities to control the problem. Once again, he chose the interests of property investors over the needs of people trying to live in their communities. And then there's the insurance crisis, which is maybe the most spectacular failure of all. Homeowners insurance in Florida has become either impossibly expensive or completely unavailable. Major national insurance companies have pulled out of the state entirely. The ones that remain are charging premiums that can run $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year or more. For people with mortgages, you have to have insurance. It's not optional. So if you can't get affordable insurance, you can't own a home. If you already own a home and your insurance gets canceled or becomes unaffordable, you're in serious trouble. Why is this happening? Climate change, rising sea levels, stronger hurricanes, increased flooding. Insurance companies are looking at the actual risk of insuring property in Florida, and they're saying it doesn't make financial sense anymore. This was completely predictable. Climate scientists have been warning about this for decades. But DeSantis has been hostile to even acknowledging climate change. He's banned state agencies from using terms like climate change in official communications. He's rolled back environmental protections. He's continued to approve massive development projects in vulnerable coastal areas and flood zones. So you have this absurd situation where the state is encouraging people to buy homes in areas that are increasingly dangerous and uninsurable, and then when the inevitable happens, when insurance becomes unavailable or unaffordable, those homeowners are just left holding the bag. The state created a government-backed insurer of last resort called Citizens Property Insurance, and it's absolutely overwhelmed. It was meant to be a temporary backstop for people who couldn't get private insurance, but now it's covering over 1 million properties, and it doesn't have nearly enough money to pay out claims if a major hurricane hits. It's a disaster waiting to happen, and DeSantis has no real plan to fix it. Let's talk about the human cost of all of this, because that's what matters most and what DeSantis seems most determined to ignore. Real people are suffering. Teachers who have dedicated their lives to educating Florida's children can't afford to live near the schools where they work. Some are commuting 2 or 3 hours each way. Others are leaving the profession entirely because they simply can't make it work financially. Florida already has a teacher shortage, and the housing crisis is making it dramatically worse. Healthcare workers are in the same boat. Nurses, medical technicians, support staff at hospitals. They're essential workers who kept showing up during the pandemic, and now they can't afford rent in the cities where they work. Some hospitals are having trouble staffing shifts because people can't afford to live nearby. This isn't just an economic problem. This is a public health crisis. When your healthcare workers can't afford housing, everyone suffers. Service workers, the people who work in restaurants, hotels, retail, landscaping, construction, all of these industries that Florida's economy depends on, they're being priced out entirely. You're seeing situations where restaurants in wealthy areas can't find staff because nobody who works those jobs can afford to live anywhere near there. Construction companies can't find workers because laborers can't afford housing near job sites. The entire economy is being distorted by the housing crisis. Elderly Floridians on fixed incomes are getting destroyed. People who retired to Florida decades ago, who own their homes outright, are being hit with property tax increases and insurance costs that they can't afford on Social Security. Some are being forced to sell homes they've lived in for 30 or 40 years. Others are taking out reverse mortgages or going into debt just to stay in their homes. These are people who did everything right, who saved and planned for retirement, and the rug is being pulled out from under them. Veterans are struggling. Florida has a large veteran population, people who served their country and settled in the state. Many of them are dealing with disabilities, health issues, limited incomes. The housing crisis is hitting them particularly hard. Veterans should be honored and supported, but instead they're being priced out and left behind. Young people growing up in Florida are looking at their future and realizing they have no path to homeownership, possibly ever. If you're in your 20s or early 30s, even with a college degree and a decent job, buying a home in Florida feels impossible. You're competing against investors with cash, against wealthy out-of-state buyers, against people making California or New York salaries who can work remotely. How are you supposed to save for a down payment when your rent takes up 60 or 70% of your income? The answer is you can't. So you rent forever, building no equity, accumulating no wealth, with no stability and no security. The racial dimensions of this crisis are stark and disturbing. Communities of color in Florida are being disproportionately displaced. Historic black neighborhoods in Miami like Liberty City and Overtown, in Orlando, in Tampa, these communities that have existed for generations are being gentrified at a shocking rate. Property values are skyrocketing. Long-time residents are being pushed out. White and wealthy newcomers are moving in. The cultural and historical fabric of these neighborhoods is being erased. This isn't accidental. This is how housing crises always work. The people with the least wealth, the least political power, the least access to resources, they're the ones who get hurt first and hurt worst. And DeSantis' policies have accelerated this displacement. By refusing to protect tenants, by refusing to require affordable housing in new developments, by refusing to regulate investor purchases, his administration has essentially given the green light to the destruction of working-class communities and communities of color. DeSantis can't hide from this anymore because it's affecting too many people, including people who voted for him. The backlash is coming from all directions. Progressive activists who warned about this from the beginning are saying, "I told you so," and they're organizing. But it's not just progressives. Moderate Republicans, conservative business owners, people who have no natural affinity for left-wing politics, they're all starting to say something has to change because the current situation is unsustainable. Some Republican legislators in Florida have actually started proposing reforms. Bills to limit corporate purchases of single-family homes. Legislation to provide real incentives for affordable housing development. Proposals to strengthen certain tenant protections. And DeSantis has been remarkably cool to most of these ideas. He's stuck in this ideological box where any government intervention in housing is seen as anti-free market, anti-business, anti-Florida values. But you can't eat ideology. You can't live in a principle. At some point, pragmatism has to win out over rigid ideology, or people are going to suffer unnecessarily. Here's what's truly damning about DeSantis' handling of this crisis. He had options. There were things he could have done. Other states and cities facing similar pressures have implemented policies that actually help. Inclusionary zoning requirements that make developers include affordable units in new projects. Community land trusts that keep housing permanently affordable. Tax incentives for building workforce housing. Strong tenant protections that prevent exploitative rent increases and unfair evictions. Support for first-time homebuyers. Real regulation of corporate landlords and short-term rentals. Investment in public and social housing. These aren't radical ideas. They're proven solutions used successfully in cities and countries around the world. But DeSantis rejected all of them in favor of a pure free market approach. And we're now seeing definitively that the free market alone cannot solve housing. Housing is too fundamental, too tied to human well-being and dignity, to be treated purely as a commodity for profit maximization. You need government playing a role. You need rules and regulations and public investment. Every developed country with a functioning housing system understands this. The exposure of Florida's housing crisis is also exposing the limits of DeSantis' entire governing philosophy. He's tried to build his brand on this idea that less government is always better, that regulations are always bad, that the market will solve everything if you just get out of the way. But housing is the perfect example of where that philosophy fails catastrophically. When you remove guardrails, predatory actors exploit people. When you don't invest in public goods, private markets don't fill the gap for low and moderate income people because there's no profit in it. DeSantis also can't hide behind the excuse that this is just a national problem or that it's Biden's fault or whatever other deflection he might try. Yes, housing affordability is a challenge across much of the country, but Florida's crisis is particularly severe, and it's directly tied to state-level policy choices that DeSantis made or supported. He can't run on the Florida model being superior and then blame federal policy when that model produces terrible outcomes. You don't get to take credit for the good and deflect blame for the bad. What happens next is the critical question. Can this be fixed, or is Florida's housing market broken beyond repair? The honest answer is it can be fixed, but it's going to take years, and it's going to require a complete reversal of current policy. Florida would need to implement strong tenant protections immediately. They'd need to crack down on corporate landlords and require transparency and fairness in rental practices. They'd need to heavily incentivize affordable housing construction, possibly even invest in public housing directly. They'd need to address the insurance crisis honestly, which means acknowledging climate change and implementing serious adaptation and mitigation strategies. They'd need to regulate short-term rentals to preserve residential housing stock. They'd need to provide real support for first-time homebuyers and people struggling with housing costs. But none of this is going to happen as long as DeSantis maintains his current ideological stance. And that's why the exposure of this crisis matters so much politically. Voters need to understand that this is a policy failure, not an inevitable market outcome. They need to connect the dots between the decisions DeSantis made and the housing nightmare they're living through. And they need to demand different leadership with different priorities. For the millions of Floridians dealing with this crisis right now, the advice is limited but important. Know your rights as a tenant, even though Florida's tenant protections are weak. Document everything with your landlord. Look for tenant assistance programs and housing counseling services. If you're a homeowner struggling with insurance, shop around aggressively. Consider higher deductibles if you can afford the risk. Look into mitigation measures that might lower your premiums. Get politically involved at every level. Show up to city council meetings. Contact your state representatives. Support candidates who prioritize housing affordability. Make noise. The more people demanding change, the harder it becomes for politicians to ignore the problem. The exposure of Florida's housing crisis should also be a warning to the rest of the country. This can happen anywhere. When you prioritize investors over residents, when you treat housing purely as a commodity, when you gut protections and reject public solutions, you get a market that works wonderfully for wealthy and fails catastrophically for everyone else. Other states need to learn from Florida's mistakes, not repeat them. DeSantis can't hide this anymore because it's too big, too widespread, affecting too many people. Teachers, nurses, veterans, retirees, young families, they're all struggling and they all have votes. The political pressure is building. The question is whether DeSantis will respond with actual solutions or whether he'll continue down the same failed path while more and more Floridians lose their homes, their stability, and their hope for the future. Time will tell, but one thing is certain: the Florida housing crisis is exposed, and it's not going away. Thanks for watching. If this opened your eyes to what's really happening, share this video. Get the word out. Drop a comment telling me about your housing situation, whether you're in Florida or anywhere else dealing with these issues. And please hit that subscribe button, because we're going to keep following this story, keep holding politicians accountable, and keep fighting for housing justice. We're all in this together, and together we can demand better.